Hi guys, I'm very sorry about that. It keeps logging me off and wanting me to refresh my phone, and I seem not to be able to go live with my computer. So I'm very sorry about that. Let me just rush to finish. I've already taken up so much of your time. I'm very sorry about that, guys. Okay, the second instance that we were talking about was where the deceased is survived by the descendants and the spouse, which is where the deceased had children and a wife or husband. So you have, let's say, two children and your spouse, and then you pass on. Before we also get into this example, let me just explain also what we call a child's portion, a child's share. A child's share, please project. A child's share is the total value of the estate divided by the number of children plus the number of spouses. So if you have 3 children and 1 wife, it will be the total value of your estate divided by 4, which is 3 plus 1. Or if you have 3 children and 2 spouses, then it will be the total number of your estates divided by 3 plus 2, which is 5. That is how we calculate a child's share. So in the instance where you are survived by your descendants and a spouse, your spouse will get either a child's share or 250,000 rand, whichever is the greater between the two. I don't know if I need to repeat that. Oh, okay. If I'm audible, then it's fine. So in the instance that you pass on, your spouse would then get either a child's share or 250,000 rand, whichever is the greater between the two. So let's say, for example, you die and you have 3 children and a spouse, like I already said. And we say, for example, the estate has a value of about 200,000. I'm just using this amount hypothetically to try and show an example. We first need to ascertain, the first thing that we need to ascertain is how much is a child's share. Is it greater or smaller than 250,000? If the child's share is greater than 250,000, that is what the spouse will get. But if it's smaller, then the spouse must get 250 or that smaller value. So if the value of the estate in total is 200,000, then it means immediately from the very beginning, we already have a shortfall towards the 250,000. So the spouse gets the entire 200,000, which is the value of the estate, and the kids do not get anything. That is because the spouse has the first right to the estate. And remember, we are only talking about that 50% of your estate, of the deceased estate, if you are married in community of property. If, for instance, you die, you have your 2 children and a wife. That's another scenario that I just made to be able to explain this second scenario. And the value of your estate is 450,000. It's no longer 200,000 now. You have 2 children and the value of your estate is 450,000. Your spouse is also still alive. Then the first thing we ascertain, the child's share. How much is the child's share? Then we will say 450 divided by 2 plus 1, which is 3. You will get an amount which is lesser than 250,000. Therefore, the spouse will then get 250,000, which is the minimum as per regulations made by the minister now. and then the remainder, which is 200,000, will then be given to your children in equal shares. So your wife will get 250,000 and your two kids will get 100,000 each. I don't know if that makes sense. Now, just another example to further explain the same scenario. I just played around with numbers to sort of explain the situation. Somebody passes on and they had 4 children and a spouse. So it means the child's share now is 4 plus 1, which is 5. If the total value is, for example, 10 million, then you will say 10 million divided by 5, that gives you 2 million each. Then that is what the spouse will get, not the 250, because it's the minimum. So if the value of the estate is less than 250, the spouse gets 250, or that minimum amount, which is the value of the estate. I made an example of an estate that is 200,000. The spouse will get everything, the children won't get. I made an example of where the estate is a little bit higher than 250, then the spouse will get 250, and then the children get the lesser amounts. Where the estate is by far more than the 250,000, then the spouse gets the child's share and not the 250,000. Right, the third scenario is where the deceased did not have a spouse or children, but the deceased had parents. So you are neither married, or you were married but your spouse predeceased you, and you don't have any children that are alive. Then what would happen is that your parents would then become your heirs in 50% shares if both of them are still alive. So your mother would get 50% and your father would get 50%. What happens if your spouse die at the same time with no children and no will, however both parents are still alive? Oh, that is my next example. Thanks, Vyoka Zimenye. What would happen is that for your 50%, if you are married in community of property, your parents would then be the heirs of your 50% in equal shares. So your mother would get 50% and your dad would get 50%. The same thing happens for your husband. His 50% will be shared amongst his parents in equal shares on condition that they are both alive. In a situation where your parents are not alive, but your other parents' children are still alive, so your own brothers and sisters. So for instance, I have a sister and a brother, but both my parents, or one of my parents, has passed on. That means that if I die and I don't have a spouse and children, my 50% of my estate goes to my dad and 50% goes to my mom. And if my mom has predeceased, then that 50% that is supposed to go to my mom will be shared by my mom's descendants, which is my brother and sister, in equal shares. So what will effectively happen is that 50% of my estate will go to my dad, 25% will go to my sister, and 25% will go to my brother. I hope that makes sense. So basically what happens in interstate succession, you first go down as deep as you can. If you can't go any more deeper, then you come back and go up to your parents. When you get to your parents, you go horizontally and go down by your parents, because whoever cannot earn or cannot take or accrue something from an estate, their descendants can stand in their position. It's what we call persterpes in law. You go as deep as you can for that particular beneficiary before you can disinherit that person and look for another nearest relative. Where the deceased doesn't have a spouse, doesn't have children, doesn't have parents, but has siblings. That's the part that I just explained now. So Tshepo has no children, has no husband, the parents have predeceased. Then what would happen? The equal shares would then be shared by the other children or other descendants of the parents, because they then stand in the place of the person that was supposed to get the benefit. In the instance where there's no spouse, there's no children, there's no parents, there's no siblings, and there's no descendants of the siblings. Okay, let me just explain this part of the descendants of the siblings. So Tshepo has passed on, no children, no husband, no parents, but there's siblings. Let's say I have 2 siblings. Like in the example that I made, I have a brother and a sister, and one of my parents has passed on. Let's just continue with that example. So what would then happen? My father gets 50% of my deceased estate. My brother and sister get 25-25. But then it so happens that my sister has predeceased me. So what happens to her 25?